So in my last video, I carved a mug out of the end of this piece of wood. Today, I'm going to turn the rest of this piece of wood into some floating shelves for our dining room. But before I do that, if you're new to the channel, I've got a bunch of other build projects you can check out. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. I plan to keep making these, but without further ado, let's get into the build. I'm going to make 2 shelves from this piece of wood, but this video will just show the first one. Each shelf is going to be about 3 feet long, so I measure and mark 3 feet and then make the cut. My miter saw was just barely big enough to handle this cut, but it got the job done. This piece of wood was rough cut with a live edge, so before I could fasten it to the wall, I had to smooth out all the surfaces and apply a protective finish to it. I clamped a small piece of wood to the end of the bench to act as a planing stop, and then I began to plane the faces of the piece of wood to make them flat. A hand plane is great in this application because it's able to remove material faster than a sander would. I use it here to get rid of the obviously high spots so that the faces would be relatively flat. This will save me a lot of time later on when I go to do the sanding. I did the top and the bottom of the shelf, and then I went to work on the back of it. This side will be the one up against the wall, and because of that you won't be able to see it. It's not super important to make it perfectly smooth, but you want to make sure it's flat so there's no gaps where the shelf meets the wall. And as you can see here in this shot, there was a section near the end that was quite a bit lower than the rest, so I just kept planing away the higher part until I brought it down to that level. You can see how eventually I'm able to take even passes across the entire surface. Once I had everything relatively flat, I was ready to start sanding. For the live edge, I got rid of all the pieces that fell off easily and then only gave it a light sanding by hand. I wanted to maintain that live edge look, and I didn't want to sand away the darker color of wood that provides a nice contrast between the top of the shelf and the front of the shelf. For the top and the bottom of the shelf, I got out the palm sander and slowly worked through a few different grits of sandpaper. I started with 100, then 125, then 150, and I just took my time working through those different grits of sandpaper to get a nice smooth finish on these surfaces. To help protect the shelf, I'm going to be applying a protective finish, a homemade wipe-on polyurethane. I've been meaning to try this for a while, and for this project I actually got around to it. To make this wipe-on polyurethane, I mixed 1 part mineral spirits with 1 part polyurethane. I stirred the polyurethane before pouring it into the mixture, and I also took this opportunity to put a little bit of protective finish on my workbench, and that was completely intentional. Once it was mixed, I applied it by wiping it onto the shelf, and you can see how the wood takes on a vibrancy when this finish is applied. Over the course of a couple days, I put on a bunch of coats, waiting for it to dry in between, and then towards the end of the finishing process, I added a little bit more polyurethane to the mix as I felt I got better results this way. And while all this was going on, I prepared the wall where I was going to mount the shelf. To secure the shelf to the wall, I'm going to locate some studs in the walls, drill holes into those studs, insert some leg screws, mark those screw locations onto the shelf, drill holes into the shelf, cut the ends off the screws, and then slide those holes over the screws. Done. Thanks for watching. Okay, let's slow that down a little bit. The first thing I had to do was locate the studs in the wall. With any floating shelf, it's going to be important to be able to tie into the wood studs behind the drywall. I took my time to find the center of the studs. I use this stud finder, but if you don't have a stud finder, there's another trick I've often used to locate studs. Grab a powerful magnet and use it to find the drywall screws in the wall. Those drywall screws are drilled into the studs, and so when you find those screws, you found the studs. I marked 3 studs on the wall at the height of 55 inches from the ground. Because my shelf was 36 inches and the distance between the 2 outside studs was only 32 inches, I decided to only use those 2 outside studs to support my shelf. I could center my shelf on these and have a couple inches of overhang on each side. Once I had my locations marked, it was time to insert the leg screws. I used 2 leg screws that are 3/8 of an inch in diameter and 6 inches long, but before I could screw them into the wall, I needed to drill a pilot hole. When drilling the pilot holes for your leg screws, it's important to research what diameter hole your leg screws require. If you make the hole too small, you can damage the wood you're screwing them into. If you make the hole too big, you could end up with a loose fit. For my screws, my pilot holes needed to be 15/64 of an inch, but of course it will be different depending on what size leg screws you're using for your project. I used a ratchet to drive in the screws. I got them to where they were deep enough to be secure, but where there was enough of the screws still sticking out of the wall to offer good support for the shelves. Once the screws were in the wall, I brought in the shelf and set it on top of them. This allowed me to get a first look of what the finished product would look like. It also allowed me to mark where the screws were directly onto the back of the shelf. I marked lines on either side of the screws. All I had to do next was pick a distance from the top of the shelf and then drill there exactly in the middle of my lines. Back in the garage, I drilled those holes. I made the holes a little bit bigger than the screws to give a bit of extra wiggle room. The screws were 3/8 of an inch, the holes were 1/2 inch. I put some tape on the drill bit to make sure I drilled deep enough, but not too deep that I drilled all the way through the piece. Once the holes were drilled, the shelf was ready to be mounted onto the screws. But before I could do that, I had to cut off the heads of the screws. I used a metal cutting blade on my jigsaw to remove the end of the screws. I have safety glasses over my regular glasses here, so not only am I safe, I also look really cool as I do this. Now that the heads of the screws are off, in theory the holes of the shelf should fit over the screws. Here comes the moment of truth. And it fit. I must admit I was relieved that it worked out. At this point the shelf wasn't completely dry, so I had to take it down, but once it was fully dried I installed it permanently with some construction adhesive on the screws and on the holes. And this is what it looks like. I'm really happy with how this shelf turned out. The plan is to add another floating shelf above this one and probably a coffee bar underneath, so be sure to stay tuned to the channel to see those. But that's it for this one. Until next time, take care.